Clement told the court there are at least 5 reasons to overturn the October 1978 conviction of Hines. He told the appeals judges that the Coleman County Trial Court did not conduct a competency hearing for Hines, despite numerous stages at which Hines's mental capacity was at issue. Clement told the court that a Bryce Mental Hospital assessment of Hines's mental condition before the trial was not admissible. Clement also argues that Hines's low IQ prevented him from understanding his rights before undergoing a 9-hour interrogation, which resulted in what Clemens calls an inadmissible confession to the rapes. Clement also argued to the appeals court that while the trial was moved out of Morgan County because of possible prejudicial press coverage, holding the trial in neighboring Coleman County did little to improve the atmosphere in which the trial was conducted. Clement tied in with this argument alleged ineffectiveness on the part of Hines' lawyers. Clement says Hines' counsel failed to seek a mistrial despite inflammatory statements made to the jury. Clement also says that Hines' very low IQ prevented him from helping his counsel in his defense. Assistant Attorney General James Hampton argued for the state that Hines' trial was conducted fairly. Hampton says Hines repeatedly said he understood his rights and that his confessions were admissible. The state also argued that there was no prejudice resulting from press coverage of the Coleman County trial. The 5 members of the appeals court have taken the arguments under consideration, but it's expected that it will be some time before a decision is reached because of the lengthy transcripts which must be sifted through. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Judicial Building.
Passing motorists probably took a second look at these bicycle riders this morning because they weren't pedaling. And some of those same automobile drivers would have traded their cars on the spot for one of those bicycles had they known it only cost the riders 25 cents for a fill-up. The Bumble Bikes factory demonstration team rolled into Montgomery this morning from Dothan. The cost, only 70 cents apiece for gas. If you own a bicycle, you can own a Bumble Bike. Installed in just 20 minutes, the 3/4 horsepower 2-cycle motor turns any bicycle into a Bumble Bike. A gas throttle and clutch complete the new no-sweat bicycle. The 7-pound motor runs on regular gas, and a fill-up will power the bike about 2 hours or 55 miles at speeds over 20 miles per hour. At the Capitol, a Bumble Bike was presented to Speaker of the House Joe McCorkadale, who promptly had to try it out. Though he couldn't seem to keep it going all the time, McCorkadale likes the new bike and thinks it could be the answer to some of Alabama's energy problems.
So we're going to have to go to this, something commuting to and from work for short distances. I think it's very good. It's very easy to ride. I proved that, didn't I?
The engine will retail for about $199. Its manufacturer, Bumble Bike Motors of Dothan, says delivery of the new product should be ready by the end of this month, with plans to market the Alabama product nationwide. Sydney Kohara, WSFA TV News.
It usually takes about 3 years for a state to control a pine beetle epidemic. This one may take longer. Jim Highland of the Alabama Forestry Commission says that for every red tree you can see in the winter, 10 others will die in the spring.
Highland says there are 2 reasons the pine beetle infestation is this bad. One is that the winter has been warmer than usual and not cold enough to slow down the pine beetle. Another reason, he says, is that some landowners just don't seem to care.
On fires, they'll call us right away on fire, but the beetles kill 6.5 times more than fire, but they don't seem to worry about it. They don't lose any sleep over it or anything. And the landowners who care are cutting their spots. Some of the ones that don't seem to care are just letting it go.
Highland says if more landowners don't start cutting down their infested trees, the Forestry Commission may have to invoke a law to force them. The Commission has a toll-free number you can call to get more information about the pine beetle. The number is 1-800-392-5679. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News.
The Alabama Senate today officially requested Alabama's congressional delegation to seek changes in federal Medicaid guidelines, hopefully to reduce the cost to the state of providing Medicaid services. 2 new tax bills were introduced in the Senate, which could also help the financially troubled Medicaid system. Coleman Senator Fina St. John says the bills would raise revenue by increasing the corporate income tax from 5% to 8%. The other bill would eliminate federal income tax payments as a deduction on state income tax returns. Senator Edward Robertson of Northport expressed his disgust at the abuses of the Medicaid program, saying at one point, quote, "If I don't do something about it, I'm going to vote against my own self," unquote. Meanwhile, the House gave second readings to another pair of tax bills. Both would increase the tax on motor fuel. The new revenue would help the ailing highway maintenance program. The House took no immediate action on a resolution setting up a committee to look into a recent federal probe of the state's coal industry. That investigation has reached into the Alabama legislature. Instead of voting on the matter, the resolution was sent to the House Rules Committee. That committee is headed by Representative Jack Biddle of Gardendale. Biddle is one of 7 persons indicted last fall by a federal grand jury in Birmingham. Dennis Latham, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
Kennedy says he's had a hard time getting publicity on domestic issues. He says his comments in the news are always related to the Middle East crisis. Young Kennedy says his uncle, Senator Edward Kennedy, is running because of domestic issues like inflation, recession, and the energy crisis. He says it's the responsibility of journalists to get at these issues and to see that President Carter faces them. Kennedy says the country's failure of the past 3.5 years is not a lack of leadership, but the president's lack of commitment of any kind.
President Carter came in Washington in 1976 saying, "I hate Washington, I'm an outsider, I'm going to remain an outsider," and he has remained an outsider, and he hasn't figured out how to manipulate the Congress and the House, but he could get help on that. And if he wanted to, he could get his bills through. And Senator Kennedy has offered time and time again to help him get those bills through. But he hasn't tried to do it.
Kennedy says the president uses a great deal of energy on his re-election campaign, but won't use that same type of energy to ask for help to pass needed legislation. Kennedy says the president is moving closer to war and says he feels the country is not ready for possible nuclear combat. Instead of using this approach, Kennedy says the president should try and improve relations with Iran and ask for its aid. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
A familiar story was retold in Memorial Coliseum Wednesday night. The Tigers jumped to an early lead, play good basketball, shooting 60% from the floor in the first half. Freshman Frank Poindexter scores 11 points. Bobby Cannage comes off the bench, grabs 11 rebounds. Tigers lead at the half, 40-32. Auburn increases its lead to 12 in the second half, and then the defense takes a brief hiatus. Vanderbilt outscores Auburn 15-3 in the following 6 minutes, tying the game. A couple questionable calls go against Auburn. Mike Rhodes gets a hot hand, scores 8 points, and Auburn loses its 6th game in a row, 77-73. It's a story that's happened several times in the past month, and Coach Sonny Smith has no answers.
You're reading it exactly like it's happening, Fred. We have had excellent play in the first half, and it's usually created by our freshmen. We substitute in, and they create a little excitement, get things going, get the flow and the running going, and we build up a good lead. We come out after the half, and we don't sustain the same effort, and it's inconsistent play, and this sometimes comes with inexperienced people, but somebody on our ball club, the veteran, somebody's got to pick up the play at that point, and we've not been able to do that. Last year in our ball club, we didn't have the killer instinct also, but most of the time we were trying to catch up. Now we're building leads, and now we don't hang on. So I don't have the answer, and I guess I'm supposed to have, but I don't have the answer.
The Tigers' biggest problem right now may be a lack of confidence, and the only solution to that is a big win. Auburn will try to pick up that victory Saturday night against Mississippi State. Fred Albers, WSFA TV Sports.
What's the clown pointing to now, Douglas? Very good. Okay, Douglas, remember you name things on each line for me? You want to do it again, please?
This simple test is checking a student's ability to clearly identify shapes with his or her eyes. For the past 11 years, Montgomery's Lions Club and Capital Junior Women's Club have been visiting kindergarten, first grade, and special education students throughout the county, testing the children's vision. According to Capital Junior Women's Club President Bonnie Jones, children are asked to look through the telebinocular machine and identify what shapes the aid selects. The machine magnifies an image so that a child can see a small clown as a large one. The test is scored on how many objects a child can accurately identify. Those who do not see all of the shapes correctly are tested at another station.
Take the sheet and you give it to your parents, okay? You're doing very well.
That sheet, sent home to each parent, outlines how their child scored on the telebinocular test and what steps, if necessary, might be taken to correct a possible vision problem. Following this test, a student who appears to have a problem is referred to an eye doctor, and if eyeglasses, contact lenses, or corrective surgery is needed and the family qualifies, the Montgomery Lions Club helps out with the expense, oftentimes paying the full cost. 116 families requested such aid this year, and the Lions have provided 102 children with glasses, one with corrective surgery. Mrs. Jones says it's important to have a child's eyes checked early.
Oh, at 4 years old, this is most definitely the early age. You have to wait until the children are able to understand the eye exam and this type of thing. We have a communications problem sometimes, and some of our kindergartens, when we first start testing, have just entered first grade, our kindergarten rather, and they have a problem getting the symbols down and this type of thing. So you have to wait until they know what a clown looks like and this type of thing.
This year, the Capital Junior Women's Club has made the telebinocular program more of a school project, involving members of each facility's parent-teacher association. Mrs. Jones says the Lions Club, the Capital City Junior Women, and all parents realize the importance of the test, and hopefully in later years, the students themselves will see the benefits. Paul Roth reporting for Alabama Illustrated.
From Alabama's News Center, the WSFA TV News 6 o'clock report. Bob Howell with news, Dan Atkinson weather, and Phil Snow sports.
Good evening. Faced with several major financial crises, members of the Alabama legislature are now 6 hours into the first day of 1980's regular session. And tonight we'll expand our 6 o'clock report to an hour, so you'll be able to see Governor James' State of the State message to the joint session at 6:30. But right now, Dennis Latham of our staff is standing by with a live report from the Capitol on the details from the first day of that session. Dennis?
Yes, Bob. Today was like many other days of the first opening day of the regular session. Most of the activity centered around the introduction of bills and resolutions. And usually on the first day, hundreds of bills and resolutions are introduced. There was legislative activity even before both houses gavelled into session at noon. Earlier in the day, the legislature's Joint Budget Committee met to hear a presentation from State School Superintendent Dr. Wayne Teague. Teague discussed recommendations from the Governor's Blue Ribbon Education Commission. Teague defended the plan to eliminate driver's education from public schools, saying the money, which amounts to about $8 million a year, could be better spent elsewhere. He says a person with a master's degree cannot be expected to teach driver's education. Instead, Teague suggested the local communities take up the responsibility of teaching young drivers, perhaps utilizing city police. Many members of the Senate showed up at the governor's mansion this morning for a briefing on the governor's State of the State address. Some who attended that meeting said the governor plans to ask for unearmarking of some taxes. Currently, about 84% of the state's taxes are earmarked for education. The governor also reportedly told the senators that he has plans to change some of the state's tax laws. Some of the first problems to be overcome by the legislature deal with money, or more exactly, a lack of money. 4 state agencies, the Highway Department, Medicaid, Mental Health, and the prison system, are in desperate need of funds just to keep operating. Add to all of this the annual struggle to pass the general fund appropriation and money for the state schools and many other problems that are likely to arise, and you have a very lively session. The legislature by law is limited to 30 meeting days and 105 calendar days. And if they don't do the job in that length of time, then they might find themselves right back down in Montgomery this summer in a special session. Live from the state capitol, Dennis Latham, WSFA TV News.
Thanks, Dennis. Just before the governor addresses that joint session of the House and Senate, we'll go back to Dennis at the Capitol for a preview of some of the proposals that Governor James is expected to make in his address. Alabama's preferential primary for the presidency is 5 weeks away, but you never know it judging by the number of candidates and their representatives here in Montgomery today. Here are 3 reports tonight on the campaigns of Senator Ted Kennedy, former CIA Director George Bush, and former Texas Governor John Connally.
Connally's first stop of the day was strictly personal. He paid a courtesy call to George Wallace at the former governor's home. The two have known each other since 1956. Accompanying the former Texas governor on his 3rd visit to the state was Connally's national campaign chairman, local businessman Wynton Blunt. Network newsmen were also visible throughout Connally's visit. A noontime rally complete with a warm-up band was the next stop on Connolly's Montgomery campaign trail. A large crowd had gathered at Court Square downtown to hear the Republican hopeful sharply criticize the Carter administration, an administration which he says hasn't taken adequate care of foreign relations.
Southeast Asia, there are only 3 countries in the world that I know of where they've been improved at all, and one is the Panama Canal, because we gave away the canal. Second is the People's Republic of China, because we kicked Taiwan in the teeth in order to establish relations with them. And the third is Egypt itself.
Connolly announced plans for a national telethon on February 14th to raise funds for his campaign, which he says is not supported by any federal funding. Some political observers say Connolly seemed more intense and more forceful during this trip than during previous Alabama visits, but they attributed the new note of seriousness to a quickly approaching and very important Alabama primary. Sydney Kohara, WSFA TV News.
A commercial flight brought Ethel Kennedy, Senator Edward Kennedy's sister-in-law, to Montgomery. Waiting for her arrival was her son Bobby, the senator's Alabama campaign manager. Also there was a delegation of Kennedy-pledged candidates to the National Democratic Convention. The Kennedy camp is working against several major problems as they near Alabama's March primary. 1, the financial constrictions now facing several of the presidential candidates. 2, the loss to President Carter in Iowa's primary. And 3, the fight for uncommitted black delegates in the state. Earlier, the predominantly black Alabama Democratic Conference endorsed President Carter, but a recent poll showed nearly 50% of the black vote is uncommitted. The Kennedy campaign is now addressing itself toward issues that could swing those uncommitted black Alabama votes to their side. A number of black state representatives were also at the Kennedy headquarters in downtown Montgomery to greet Mrs. Kennedy. They all applauded Bobby Kennedy's speech, which touched on the senator's support of the national health care program and blasted President Carter for proposed cuts in the welfare program. The Kennedys accuse Carter of being a Republican in disguise on these issues and want him to come out in a public forum and debate them. The Kennedys say that would turn the tide of support as Carter's popularity rides high with the Iranian and Afghan issues. Young Kennedy called Iowa's loss to Carter a disappointment, but he said the campaign was trenching in with things looking good for the Maine and New Hampshire primaries. Kennedy says they're starting an effort here to get Alabamians ready for Teddy. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News.
Barbara Bush officially opened her husband's Montgomery County campaign office today, surrounded by George Bush campaign workers and supporters. This is Mrs. Bush's 7th trip to Alabama. She says George Bush is a positive man who believes there is much good in America, but who also knows that it's not going to be easy to correct the nation's problems.
So I think what he's trying to do is talk about the positive things we can do, that if we do give tax relief to people who are going to do research and development and make more jobs in the private industry, that we can turn things around so that we are competing again. I'm sure that's the positive thing he's talking about, and in other fields somewhat the same. He's not a pessimist about the 80s, that's all. It's very discouraging, you know, to hear someone talking always about what we can't do, and George is a can-do person. That's always been a builder.
She describes her husband as a compassionate man who has no desire to be a vice presidential running mate for anyone. When asked what kind of first lady she would be, Barbara Bush said she would do what she's done for the past 35 years, be a fantastic housekeeper. And she would use her influence as First Lady to promote reading and education programs. Michael Jones, WSFA TV News.
The housing industry is an indicator of where the nation's economy is going. Kahn says the high interest and inflation rates evident in the housing industry have the same cause as in all industries. He says the consumer demand is outrunning the nation's ability to satisfy it. And he says the government's attempt to impose price controls on housing shows the futility of artificial controls.
People would simply refuse to sell, or they would wait until the controls came off, and they always come off, and then of course you'd have an explosion of house prices. So it illustrates very clearly this particular industry, the futility of trying to control inflation by government stepping in and trying to fix prices.
Kahn says private industry must join consumers in demanding that the government eliminate some of its regulations. He says that, combined with limitations on consumer demand and credit, should help curb the 13.5 inflation rate. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News.
That we are placing
At this afternoon's meeting, members of the Montgomery Complete Count Committee discussed the census questionnaire, which will be distributed by mail in late March. This will be the 20th time Americans will participate in such a nationwide count. Some 86 million households will receive the questionnaire. Census questions focus on housing data, home energy use, and transportation. Census District Manager Joan Bowen says the census is designed to help people not pry into their lives. And to inform them of the importance of completing the census, the committee has scheduled speakers throughout the month to talk to area civic and service groups. The newly annexed areas of Montgomery shouldn't feel left out. Committee members plan to visit and talk to those areas to make sure they're counted in the 1980 census, too. Sydney Kohara, WSFA TV News.
The governor and Khan met with reporters and editors at the mansion. Khan was questioned about current economic conditions, especially inflation. He says skyrocketing energy costs contribute the most to our current high inflation. He says consumption of gasoline must be slowed. And aside from deregulation, a tax such as one proposed for Alabama will help control energy use.
I hope it's not out of place for me to say that I know that the governor has advocated a tax on gasoline. I think that is absolutely great. That is that it tells the American people that here is where we have to conserve. And if we will conserve here and generate revenues, then we can also balance our budgets.
Governor James was also concerned about a balanced budget. He says one way to enable the state to add flexibility to its financial operations is to unearmark taxes. Most of the earmarked taxes go to education. Perhaps in exchange for unearmarking taxes, the governor says he wants education to receive constitutional status as an essential function of state government. He disagreed with the idea of one House member that education taxes were earmarked by the people. James says most of the taxes were earmarked by the legislature. Dennis Latham, WSFA TV News at the governor's mansion.
This sign means there's a concerned parent at home and children in trouble have a place to go. It's all a part of a block parent program sponsored by the PTA of Wares Ferry Elementary School. Some 500 students walk or ride bicycles every day, and the PTA is concerned about their safety. PTA President Becky Webb says many of the parents work and can't be at home when their children get out of school. She says the block program gives school children a place to go for help if they need it. The program hasn't officially begun yet, but Webb says they've already seen some benefits from it.
We had one parent who worked with us on the block parent program. There was a flasher in the neighborhood who exposed himself to her 9-year-old daughter. Because she had worked with the program, the daughter knew to get a description of the man, a description of the car, and the tag number. The mother called this information in to the police department. The man was arrested that night. And he was very surprised a 9-year-old could give this type of information to the police department.
The program goes into effect next Friday. Until then, policemen will meet with students to explain the program, and parent volunteers will take a first aid course. Webb says because of the program here, the PTA in Mobile County wants to implement one like it there this fall. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
Ronald Reagan says he's not worried that George Bush beat him in the Iowa caucuses, but he has changed the emphasis of his speeches since that political trial. Last November in Birmingham, Reagan dwelled on the subjects of energy, the economy, and national defense. He continually returned to the theme of government bureaucracy. Today at the Civic Center in Montgomery, Reagan still talked of the economy and the energy crisis, but he spent more time talking about the decline of U.S. defense. He praised veterans of the Vietnam War, saying they fought bravely despite the fact the government had tied one hand behind their backs. Reagan called Vietnam a war our government was afraid to let its soldiers win. He referred to the Vietnam government using terms such as godless communist tyranny. And he said the U.S. defense system is representing the 1980s with technology of the 40s. Reagan's conservative policies won him 65% of Alabama's Republican vote in 1976. He's evidently hoping the same policies will get a similar response from Alabamians in March. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News.
Yeah, they sure do with, with their personnel. They're a very well-coached team. Yeah, they cause you all kinds of problems. We'll have to play as good as we can play again to have a chance to win.
You're 2 games out now. What's your thinking on the SEC race?
Well, we got 5 games to play. 5 games to play, and we're just going to cinch up and play them as hard as we can.
More than 1,200 competitors from 176 schools are competing in this year's indoor championships. There are 4 divisions: junior high, 1 and 2A, 3A, and 4A schools. Most of today's outstanding performances came in the 2-mile run. This is Lisa Seville of J.T. Wright High School in Mobile running the gun lap. She had led the whole race, lapping the entire field, but she still had some kick left for the end. It was the most outstanding performance of the afternoon. Seville finished the 2-mile run with a record time of 11:51.85 seconds, nearly a full minute better than the previous record. The boys were not to be outdone. Paul Williams of UMS in Mobile also set a 2-mile record with a run of 9:56.87 seconds. That's 4 full seconds better than last year's record. Team point totals are only partially completed, but Grissom High in Huntsville has to be near the top of the girls' 4A division. Barbara Hoisington and Linda Patterson finished 1-2 in the 2-mile run. Hoisington broke the record she set last year, running at 11:45.49 pace. She collapsed after finishing the race, but preliminary reports indicate she is in satisfactory condition. The meet will continue through tomorrow with award ceremony scheduled for 8:30 Saturday night. Fred Albers, WSFA TV Sports.
Speed was the byword in today's opening events. 21 records were set today, 7 of them coming in this evening's competition. Tonight's attention centered on the 60-yard dash and the 60-yard hurdles. However, just the preliminaries were run. The finals will be run tomorrow. There was a distinctly local flavor to tonight's events. Herman Vaughn of Montgomery's Robert E. Lee High School successfully defended his 880 title. Vaughn sped the distance in 1 minute 58.65 seconds. That's 3 seconds shy of the record he set last year. And Laura Nielsen of Catholic High won the girls' 2A shot put with a toss of 31 feet 8 inches. Team point totals are still fairly sketchy, but Lehigh is in 3rd place of the boys' 4A division with 7 points. Murphy of Mobile leads all the schools with 12 points. Tomorrow the field events get underway at 10 o'clock. The finals of the track competition start at 2, and the award ceremonies are scheduled for 8:30 tomorrow night. Fred Albers, WSFA TV Sports.
Ben and Mary Ann Bowden operate a large diversified farm in Russell County, Alabama. The Bowden farm produces 6 different commodities on 5,000 plus acres with a couple of dozen pieces of rolling stock and equipment and 15 full-time employees. Keeping up with everything was becoming a growing problem, so 3 months ago the Bowdens bought a small computer. Mrs. Bowden is the operations bookkeeper, and she believes the computer will eventually bring a new efficiency to the Bowden farm.
We hope to use it for payroll, have a payroll program, something to do the W-2s at the end of the year, that sort of thing, and maybe get into a check writing program. I think we'll be able to keep up with the separate pieces of equipment, the separate crops and so forth. They're just unlimited possibilities, I think, if you can learn what to do with it, but it takes me a while. It brings a lot of little messages on when you put the wrong thing in. It tells you that you're wrong, that you've made mistakes, and it's kind of interesting to have it comment to you, and you begin to feel like it's somebody almost, because it does tell you when you've done the wrong thing or what to do next.
The computer's remarkable ability to store and evaluate data has already revealed some useful management information about the farm. What have you learned that you didn't know before?
Well, one of the things was the amount of money that I was spending on chemicals, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. We're running about 20% of my gross income was being spent on these items, and of course we got to have them. But I think maybe this is one area that we may be able to save a little money, hopefully.
Computer use on the farm does have its problems. There's a lack of agriculturally oriented program tapes, and it's sometimes difficult to find the advice and assistance on the technical level in rural areas. These things may slow the spread of computer use on the farm.
According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the pitcher plant is found only in Alabama and Georgia and is now threatened with extinction. The director of the Farm Bureau Federation's Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, Dick Fifield, says questions are being raised as to how the government plans to protect the plant. At a hearing last week in Gadsden, the public was invited to share its ideas about the plant's future with government officials. Fifield says the Fish and Wildlife Service lists the plant's natural locations in 6 Alabama counties: Elmore, Cherokee, DeKalb, Jackson, Etowah, and Marshall. In addition, the service notes all of the plants have been eradicated from Elmore County. However, that land remains covered under the Act. That's what many people are concerned over. With an endangered species, extra steps must be taken to protect the natural habitat, and in some cases that could mean turning away new industries or not building new farm drainage systems vital to enriching soil. Fifield says the government is so concerned about the plant, it's keeping all locations secret. Despite testimony from the public hearing, the plant is slated to be listed as an endangered species in April, unless the matter is taken to court. Paul Roth, WSFA TV News. It's called a Scouting Show and Do exhibit, and there's everything from a pitched tent and pine box derby race to lashing a tall tower. According to Show and Do Chairman Jack House, scouting has changed with the times. He says merit badges needed to attain Eagle Scout have become more sophisticated. For instance, there are now badges for space exploration and computer science, subjects that 20 years ago were still being pioneered. House says scouts from 11 to 18 have a new sense of nationalism and are proud to wear their uniform along with the American flag. He notes that this demonstration attracted scouts from 8 local troops and 2 Cub Packs. However, former scouts of all ages have dropped by to tell these youngsters all about scouting in years gone by. If there's one thing that's synonymous with scouting, it's fun. House says the 2 words are interchangeable, and the smiles attest to that. Paul Roth, WSFA TV News.
I didn't just go on to work hard like I did.
Did you work? What kind of work did you
Oh,
do?
no, nothing special. We just want housework and such as that.
Taking care of your children?
Yeah, taking care of my children.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Mama. Happy birthday to you. And many, many more. 100.
Reagan says the best way to handle the crisis in the Middle East is to make the United States presence known in the Persian Gulf. He says this should be done by putting air power and a naval base on the Persian Gulf. He says the Soviets will then get the message and realize there's no place for them to go. Reagan says the Soviets have gotten away from the original idea of détente. He says détente is based on the idea that there could be no winner in a nuclear war.
The Soviet Union almost immediately turned away from that. The Soviet Union has made it plain that they not only believe that a nuclear war is survivable, they believe that it is winnable. And they have geared their entire military buildup, including a gigantic civil defense program.
Reagan says the Russians could destroy 10 times as many Americans as we could Russians because of the Soviets' multi-billion-dollar civil defense efforts. He says America has been derelict in research of defensive weapons to be used against Soviet missiles, but says he's not in favor of putting America on a similar war footing with Russia. He says he would like to strengthen this country's nuclear force to the point where the Russians won't want to attack. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
first one is Investigator Wayne I. Butler. Second one is Investigator Billy W. Smith. And the third one is Officer Michael S. Ward. Now, you will notice these are alphabetical, and that the order in which I listed them does not have anything to do with how they will be selected.
The George Lindsay Celebrity Weekend raises most of the money for Special Olympics in Alabama. The Special Olympics program provides mentally retarded and handicapped children a chance to participate in sports. In Alabama, Special Olympics gets no money from the state. It's operated out of the Office of the Governor's Commission on Physical Fitness, which is state-funded. A routine audit shows that $7,400 of the $100,000 raised for Special Olympics last year went to pay for office expenses for the Governor's Commission. Commission Director Danny Long says the National Special Olympics Association requires its state branches to have offices. And since Special Olympics is operated through the Commission, he says it's only fair that Special Olympics pays some of the expenses. Long admits that the Special Olympics Executive Committee has never authorized that expenditure, but he says the committee has given him authority to do what's necessary in the daily operation of the Olympics program. And he says he can't get official permission to use Special Olympics money to pay for Governor's Commission expenses because the committee has no chairman or vice chairman. Long says he wants the Attorney General to resolve the situation. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News.
Well-placed sources have told me that officials from and the records of many PSC-regulated companies have been subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury, with more subpoenas to be issued. A number of operators of telecommunication pager companies from all over the state were sitting outside the grand jury room today. All of their companies are regulated by the PSC. Montgomery District Attorney Jimmy Evans wouldn't comment on the group in the courthouse hallway, but it's believed that they were all here to testify about the Public Service Commission investigation. Evans has told me that the investigation might focus on several people.
Nobody's singled out on any kind of witch hunt. No one particular person is the object of some sort of investigation into one particular person's conduct.
An earlier Associated Press report had indicated that former Commission President Juanita McDaniel was the focus of this particular investigation. I've also been told that as many as 36 PSC staff members have been recalled to testify before the grand jury. They're all expected to be there sometime tomorrow. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News. After 2 hours of discussion, the Commission approved 6 resolutions for general and special taxes. The first resolution deals with the 5.1 mil tax for general fund expenses and the 2.6 mil tax for roads and bridges. The 2nd through 5th resolutions contain special taxes for public schools. The 6th deals with the 1-cent gasoline tax. Commission Chairman H.B. McKinney said he was upset with what he called the last-minute handling of the information. McKinney said he found it hard to vote on a tax resolution without knowing what the figures represented. Discussion came to a halt at one time when the commissioners wanted more information. County Tax Assessor Marvin Driver and Collector Bill Lyerly, along with 2 aides, talked with the commission for over 2 hours about methods of determining any dollar effect due to an increase or decrease in the millage structure. The commission has the option of adjusting its millage because it increased them just before the 1978 lid bill. The commission said it was concerned about having to make those adjustments today without first knowing how much tax money will be generated. But it was later clarified that those adjustments could come later. The adjustments are allowed in cases where original revenue projections don't match the actual generations. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News.
The Montgomery County educators responded enthusiastically to Paul Hubbard of the Alabama Education Association when he said that earmarking is necessary to make sure politicians spend tax money where the people want them to. He urged the teachers not to be satisfied with conditional bonuses paid out of the general fund when the money is available. He says that arrangement may bring immediate gratification but will hurt teachers in the long run. And he says teachers should contact parents and legislators to try and get more support.
The story is a good story. It's a story that needs to be told over and over and over again. I think we can win this issue on a positive note. In my opinion, if we can win on the earmarking issue, then we're going to find legislators that are going to be comfortable with putting salary increases as a #1 priority.
Hubbard says if teachers take a positive approach, he thinks they'll get a sympathetic hearing from the legislature. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News. The citizens came to listen and to talk. They listened to spokesmen from the governor's office and the highway department who support the proposed 5% gasoline tax. And they listened to a gas distributor who is against a percentage tax. Proponents of the tax say a cents per gallon tax is insufficient because as consumers cut down on the number of gallons they use, the state loses revenue. But the gas distributor says a percentage tax is unfair because it takes the power of increasing taxes away from legislators and gives it to the Arabs. But the citizens also came to talk. Some berated the highway department representatives, saying they're overburdened with taxes already. Others challenged the gas distributor, reflecting some of the resentment consumers feel about paying high gas prices. Several persons echoed the sentiment that if you don't have the money for something, you do without it. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News.
First of all, we had a reduction.
The interest in forming a group to support Taiwan was sparked when the U.S. government decided to recognize mainland China rather than the island republic. One of the reasons for the move is that the U.S. thought communist China would be a bigger market for U.S. goods. But supporters of Taiwan say the move means more competition, especially for the southeastern United States.
We in the textile areas of the nation are in for a real deluge of foreign imported I'm afraid the only word for it is slave labor manufactured textile goods. And I think we had best be on the lookout for it and do what we can to stop it. That's going to be one of the areas of economic warfare that's going to be waged against us in the coming year.
Buttram says the nonprofit, non-political organization must keep Americans aware of the differences between mainland China and Taiwan. Lisa Nielsen, WSFA TV News.
Working out of the trunk of his car, 60-year-old Bob Maddox of Hollywood, Florida, is running for the Democratic presidential nomination on a low-budget campaign. He wants, he says, to preserve the idea that you don't have to be rich to run for president. His only previous political race was an unsuccessful bid for a seat on his home county commission. Maddox says inflation is America's #1 problem, and mandatory wage and price controls are needed to deal with it. On foreign affairs, strength, not talk, is needed in dealing with the Soviet Union. And he feels this type of forcefulness is why people should vote for Bob Maddox.
We need a man in as president, and like Bob Maddox, who has got the guts of Harry Truman to do what he says he will do.
And not for his 3 major opponents.
Mr. Carter has used too much rhetoric and not enough cure. As far as Ted Kennedy is concerned, he's the last of the really big spenders, and I don't think we can afford him. Jerry Brown, as far as I'm concerned, is just not presidential material.
Despite the seemingly insurmountable odds stacked against him, Maddox theorizes he can win the nomination if a deadlock emerges at the national convention.
I think after that roll is called maybe 50 times, that the delegates are going to get tired, they're going to get disgusted. And that's when I'm going to have my delegates put the pressure on what's wrong with Bob Maddox. It won't be the first time that a dark horse has won the nomination. And that's the way I expect to make it.
Michael Jones, WSFA TV News.
Phil, we know what we have to do. We've got a #1 rating to protect, and we're trying to go undefeated in that district. You know, it's the way basketball games are designed, and the way basketball is designed, that you have to live it down right quick, and because you always got another one coming right behind the other one. So, you know, it won't be hard. We're going to finish this out in the next couple of hours and get back to work, you know, with what we know we have to do, and that's Thursday night, go over to AM and play, and it's going to be a tough.
That time by Mitchell.
But how is it that you got to Ohio State as a swimmer? Swimming wasn't a big item for sure around the Montgomery area.
Well, I guess that was an accident too. I really started swimming by accident and swam for the Birmingham Athletic Club in Birmingham. And we made all the regional meets, the Southeastern AAU, Mid-Atlantic meets, and I did fairly well, and I was invited to participate in a national AAU meet at Jones Beach in New York. And I came out second in the national meet, and Mr. Mike Pepe, who was the coach at Ohio State, thought that I would be useful to the Ohio State swimming team, and I transferred from Alabama to Ohio State.
Now, after you had qualified for the Olympics, where did you and the rest of the Olympic hopefuls go to train, and at what time was that?
Bob Kippeth, the swimming coach at Yale University, invited all of the people who were expected to make the team to New Haven for the spring quarter of 1936. And I was invited, and I spent some time in New Haven training with the people who made the team.
It was at that point that you decided not to go?
It was probably after I'd been up there about 30 days. And the reason for backing out at that point was because Adolf Hitler was the Fuhrer in Germany at the time.
Was this a moral thing to you, your family? The purge of the Jews had begun years before that, and this was big news and a big controversy over the world. Was that the reason?
I think that played a big part in it, yes. And the fact that there were things going on in Germany that were absolutely the opposite of the way I felt about the way things should be.
Gene, have you had occasion since to regret the decision not to go?
Well, for a number of years, I really didn't give it a thought. But I had an occasion to go to Germany a few years ago, and I saw the whole Olympic complex there.
It was magnificent, wasn't it?
And it was gorgeous. And I felt that maybe I missed a glorious opportunity, something that would have meant something to me for a long time, regardless of my reasons at the time. Sometimes I think it may have been a little cowardly on my part for not going.
There were Jewish members of the team that did go that year.
There were a few, yeah. I was on the water polo team at Ohio State, which is not a big thing. Black man, and I think he was second in the high jump in the Olympics. He made the Olympic team too. All of Mike's divers were in the show. I have a feeling for the athletes who've been training because I know what they've been through, but I personally don't think we ought to do anything to aid and abet the Russians. So I'm sort of, even though I'm not a big Carter supporter, I think that this time we should go along with what he'd like to do.
You followed those 36 Olympics through the papers, I would assume.
Oh, yeah.
Did you know Jesse Owens at the time? He was an Ohio State football player, all sports player.
I knew Jesse Owens. As a matter of fact, the first day I arrived on the campus and proceeded to the gymnasium, Jesse Owens was standing there talking to my coach, Mike Pepe. And I knew him for my whole stay at Ohio State, and he was really a fine gentleman and a great athlete.
Did you take particular satisfaction in knowing him after he won 4 gold medals and deflated the idea of Nordic superiority?
By all means, and I think that even though Hitler turned his back on Jesse when he got his 4th gold medal, he had received a big ovation for the first 3.
How painful was your runner-up position? How damaging was that finish in Iowa to your campaign?
Not at all, and it was not a great surprise to us. George moved in there, took a house in Iowa 8 months before I even became a candidate. With our strategy, which is based on the fact that there are 35 primaries to go in the country, there was no way that we could afford to spend the time and effort that he did there. He put together an organization, and a year's campaigning paid off by about a 1% victory, but even there it isn't really clear-cut, because, you know, that vote was a beauty contest. kind of a caucus, but in those same evenings, those same meetings, voted to choose delegates for their next conventions, not the national convention, for their congressional district conventions. I won 62 counties and he only won 32. So I don't feel too badly about Iowa.
Do you think the people of the United States are ready and willing in 1980 to elect a, quote, conservative, close quote, candidate for president?
I have put it many times in speaking to party audiences that what we've been talking about, those of us who are called conservative, all these years, the people, Democrat, Independent, and Republican, are now demanding. The very things that a few years ago sounded as warnings when we said them, the people now recognize, and that is the failure of the federal government to solve the major problems, and particularly in these last 3 years.
Of course, we will be having our first presidential primary in Alabama on March the 11th, and all of your campaign supporters and many of the so-called experts think you're going to win by an overwhelming margin. Do you share that optimism? Certainly, sir.
Well, let me just say I am hopeful that they're right. I haven't had an opportunity to talk too much to all of them about it, and hear some of the facts. I have been aware of their enthusiasm since I arrived last night, but I'd like to hear more of their facts about it, and I'd be delighted if they are right. I happen to believe that the Northeast, where the first primaries are going to take place, never have been really my territory. As I come south and move west, I get into my areas of strength.
Lastly, Governor, I'd like to throw several quick questions at you for some short, concise answers on some of the major issues that are of importance to all of us, especially Alabamians. Do you favor the boycott of the Olympics?
I favor moving the Olympics from the Soviet Union to another country, and then I would like to see us engage in a study to see if maybe to really preserve the spirit of the Olympics, we shouldn't return them permanently to where they started and hold them every 4 years in Greece.
How do you feel about the registration of the young men and young women for draft?
I don't believe in a peacetime draft, and I don't believe that registration would materially advance the schedule if you had to have a draftee army in an emergency by which that army would be ready, that all it would do is create an army of paper shufflers for that registration.
And about the women?
And I don't believe that women should be drafted. Women served in every branch of the service in World War II and served nobly and well, and they were volunteers, and there's just something about the drafting of them that I don't buy.
And lastly, sir, what would you have done differently than President Carter has done in handling the crisis in Iran?
Well, I don't think he's done anything he couldn't have done in the first 48 hours. All the diplomatic moves that he made. But I think when the diplomatic moves fail, then I think a government has to set a date for the release of those hostages and propose an action to those who are holding them that will be taken if that date is not met.
Well, my personal feelings is this. I don't think that people of Alabama can stand another tax, and I'm not sure we need another tax. I feel that we have a welfare program that is scandalous. If the people of Alabama knew the problems we were having with welfare, if they knew how blatant the abuses was, I believe we'd have a taxpayers' revolution and they'd run everybody out of Montgomery. So I'm not going to support a tax until we investigate our welfare program and put the people to work that can work, get the deadbeats off of welfare. And then the taxpayers, the people of Alabama, will support a tax. But until that time, they're not going to support a tax, and neither am I.
And so I propose that on Thursday, Valentine's Day, that the people going to and from their work, that they burn their headlights. And we're hoping that we can enlighten the governor and the legislature as to the opposition of the public to this excessive tax, and that they'll get down to something reasonable. And we're hoping that they will see the light and have a heart.
with experience of killing this country.
Year Out says he's running for U.S. Senator because Senator Donald Stewart has changed his position on most of the issues. The former Auburn football player says Stewart's new ideas do not coincide with those of the people he represents. He says Stewart voted to increase the food stamp budget another $600 million, voted $500 million more for public works, and voted $825 million to the World Bank. Year Out says Stewart has spent about $3 million more than he would have spent. Year Out's experience in politics is limited to managing Burt Banks' campaign for lieutenant governor. He says working in the steel mills and as an attorney for 8 years qualifies him.
People say to me, don't you think you need experience? Well, the people with experience are killing me. People with experience are killing this country. And I think it's time for new life and new breath and new ideas and people with courage to say what they think and do what they say.
Year Out says he's already gotten over $100,000 in his campaign fund. Cassandra Taylor, WSFA TV News.
And do what they say.